want to welcome everybody to the meetup here at Tibco Software. Myself, I'm Greg James. I'll introduce these fine gentlemen in just a second. My role at Tibco is I'm Chief of Staff to the CTO. He does happen to be sitting behind me, so if you talk to him later, tell him you thought I was awesome, you should keep me around longer, should pay me more, all those things would be good.
You know, you're not supposed to say that when the person's there, right?
That's okay. I'm going to say other things about you later, so it doesn't really matter. Might as well just get it all out.
That's right.
By the way, this is the last time you'll see me working at Tibco Software, so nice to know you. While you're looking for a chief of staff, I'll be available tonight. Anyway, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. We'll be talking about IoT and blockchain. Tibco is a company. Give you a little bit of intro if you don't know who we are, which is not unusual, so don't feel bad. But if you have heard of us before, raise your hand. Oh my gosh, I don't have to say anything.
That's a record?
It is a record. So our history, we've been around 20 plus years. Big in integration analytics are our heavy spots. Been doing that enterprise level for a long time. You know, if you don't know it, we're the people that invented the enterprise service bus, event-driven architectures, right? You know, ESBs and that stuff. That's us. That's how we started. Today, you know, why we do that, we do it very well. We spend a lot of time in areas of new innovation, and one of them things like blockchain and IoT, and in other areas of AI and ML and conversational UIs and so forth, right? Some areas of new innovation where doing those things is going to eventually work its way back, right? Back into the enterprise and do analytics, right? That's typically where it's going to end up at. And guess what? Those are things we do really, really well. So this just makes sense for us to start to reach down in those areas. So a lot of innovation going on. We'll be sharing a little bit of that, I think, through the questions today, talking a little bit about that. And so the format of it is a panel. I have questions I'll be walking through with these two fine gentlemen, and then we'll open up for Q&A at the end. And the last thing is, if you are here and you didn't sign up and register, this is going to be raffled off at the end. So the DJI Spark drone, I have one of these. They're awesome. Endless fun, more fun than adult deserves. By the way, keep it, do not give it to your kids. I think you deserve it more than they do. So if you haven't signed up, they'll sign up for this, right, for raffle deal. Okay, so let me start off. I'll introduce two gentlemen here. We have Abhi Dugar, and he is the Director of Cloud Infrastructure and IoT Security at IDC. So thank you, Abhi, for joining us. Appreciate it. And then Nelson Petracek is Chief Technology Officer for Tibco Software. And again, he's my boss. So thank you guys both for participating. I appreciate it, taking time to be here with us.
You didn't give me a choice.
I thought it was the other way around.
Oh yeah,
But yeah, thank you guys. And I thought what we do before we got into questions and just for the audience, sake of the audience, is let each of you spend a few minutes talking about your background and your roles at your current company. So we'll make him go first.
Oh, yeah, here we go. Yeah.
He can boss through the.
See,
I got to tell you what I do now. That's going to be fun.
And I know which questions, right, that he didn't come up with, so he's going to answer those first.
Exactly. Tough crowd here today. I can see how this is going to go. All right, so I'm actually out of Calgary, Canada. So I'm going to be the Canadian in the crowd. I don't know if anybody else is from there, used to live there, anything along those lines. We were talking about hockey before, which is stereotypical, but we got to do it. So my CTO for Tibco, definitely focused on a lot of the areas that Greg mentioned. One of the things that we are looking at heavily is blockchain, more from an enterprise context. I've been trying to convince our CFO to allow me to do a Tibcoin, but so far I haven't had any success with that. We'll see. Good conversation still going on. But really for us, it's really around how we can make it easier for people to consume blockchain technology from an enterprise standpoint, right, regardless of the vertical. We'll talk about some use cases across different verticals today. But part of my role of what I do here is really look at the applicability of these kinds of technologies. Where do they fit in the enterprise? How can they be adopted by an enterprise? When would you use them? And more importantly, when would you not use them? Because I have a lot of use cases where you just raise your hand and you go, no, right? That's not a blockchain use case. Yes, it's got a lot of hype. It's got a lot of interest nowadays. But not every use case is applicable, of course, for that technology, just like all new technologies that we run into, right? As technologists, this is something we see all the time. So So my role is to kind of work through that, help customers understand the applicability of the technology, and then map our solutions back to that, or have some fun building some new stuff.
Great. So
Thanks.
I have a lot to.
That was the shortest version I've ever heard.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think what
We're gonna have to delete this recording soon.
This is the last time you'll ever let me moderate one of the panels he's on. I'm doing this on purpose.
So as I said, like I'm with IDC, and a program that I'm leading for IDC that I started a couple of years back is focusing on IoT security, because we were seeing that IoT, at least in the context of enterprise applications, critical infrastructure, where human life, climate, those kind of things are involved in factories and so on. Security, it was really the first piece of the conversation, because nobody wanted to, the liability handed to them, and from the CIO to the CSO to the CEO and the board of directors. Everybody's talking about security from an IT perspective, but now the operational side started popping up, and they wanted to do all the things that they can see at their home, and then say, oh, can I also do these things in my work? So that is how the IoT security effort started a couple of years back. So those are the kind of people I'm talking to, are the enterprises, and based on that IoT security work, the blockchain piece of it, I started focusing on towards the end of last year, mostly. So it's been about 6 months or so. And since then, there have been a lot of interest in trying to see how blockchain can be applied to and used for IoT security. So that has been somewhat of my focus. There is a broader scope of what IDC covers from a blockchain and enterprise perspective. I think you are familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, great. It's a great connection. We went in that order because one of the first things we were going to talk about, or I was going to talk about, was IoT and blockchain. And the question I had for you guys, and since you lit up so well, we'll take you and let you go first on this question, because it sounds like right in your sweet spot.
Thank you. What do you mean?
But in blockchain technology, let's talk a little bit about, let you guys talk a little bit about what blockchain offers in terms of technology that can support IoTs and security around IoT. And I think it would be great, as you said, you started up that area of study and research within IDC, and so there's probably not tons of referable use cases out there today, but if there are some we could call out for the audience, I think that would be fantastic. And then maybe even some of your own experience and insight into things you've seen or maybe you've heard from customers, I think would be great to share.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is somewhat new, as I said, but IoT as an area of research and work with the customers, that has been going on for some time. And as that progressed, the security aspect started to pop up. And what became interesting to see is that what is the nature of IoT applications? What do they have that intersects with what blockchain offers? Because the blockchain concept came from a very different direction. We became famous because of Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency market. And then when people started looking at what are the things that we are doing over there, and what are you doing in IoT, and why should the two even be connected? So that's sort of the exploration stage that I went through, and I saw when you compare IT security to IoT security, what are the differences? And then that is where the usefulness of blockchain started popping up. So for example, the distributed nature of the IoT implementation in that critical infrastructure type environment, where you could have not just tens of thousands of devices in a building in a PYOT type IT environment, but in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of devices in a smart city or transportation. So how do you have that distributed? So you could have a centralized server and control all of those, but not a very practical thing to do it that way. So immediately that type of distributed nature of blockchain, it becomes interesting. The other piece was about devices talking to other devices, which is not usually the case in an IT environment because a human is somehow involved in the loop at some point very quickly. Here, when you have tens of millions of devices, there could be devices controlling other devices that control other devices, and there could be hierarchy, and it needs to be a trustless system, because in the IT environment, the trust element is not questioned because there is an identity associated with the person. Here, in a trustless environment, you have to create a trustless environment, and again, blockchain is able to offer that. The immutability aspect of it, the transparency that you can get, the ability for parties to transact with each other without having to know who they are. All of those aspects come into the picture. And we can also look at from a micropayments perspective, where one device could be buying or selling. Maybe I'm going too much into some of the questions that you're talking about, the use case piece of it, that you could be buying and selling compute resources or storage resources or something that you need to offload to some other device. So that is how blockchain as a concept, where it is used in the cryptocurrency space from a different perspective, could be applied to IoT. But I think one thing that is different that needs to be kept in mind is the consensus model becomes pretty important, because Bitcoin obviously is a public ledger.
Right.
And
So you're saying you can't wait for an hour before transactions be validated between IoT devices? Yeah. 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 No,
As the autonomous car drives over.
yeah. No, that's right. Over the bridge and the stop sign and everything else that it went through. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been interesting talking to enterprises about IoT, because they've all been looking at it in one form or another. How many people here work with RFID? Right? I mean, that was supposed to solve everything, right? You were just going to have RFID tags on everything, and that was going to be the way the world was going to go. And that never really quite happened. At least to our knowledge, maybe we're tagged and we don't know it. So there's that aspect.
That whole bump was back there.
Yeah, we won't go there. But but now, with some of the kind of resurgence, if you will, and renewed focus on sensors and IoT devices, and even our phones, and the need to have this kind of autonomous communications down to the device level so that they're working without human involvement, things like that, you now see almost like a resurgence or renewed interest in, hey, I'm going to have all these IoT devices. How do I make sure it's the same device that I installed yesterday? How do I prevent denial of service attacks? How do I ensure that the identity of the device is actually carried through in a immutable fashion over time, so I can go back and prove the provenance of some decision that was made by that device to a regulator, a year down the road? There's a lot of these other considerations that organizations are coming to us with that say, how are we going to try and solve this at scale in a decentralized fashion in a world where these devices are open and there's going to be multiple attacks? There's going to be attempts to spoof these devices. Yeah, there's a number of different things that could go wrong here. So device identity, of course, is a critical component of this. So again, going back to how to make sure that the device is who I think it is, and we'll talk about some approaches and what people are doing in that area. But it also extends beyond that, and I find that there's, you mentioned consensus algorithms. So the traditional kind of blockchain ledger sort of approach and technology isn't as applicable to the IoT world just because of the data structures, to the consensus algorithms, even things like smart contracts. I've had this conversation around, well, I can have an IoT device, trigger a smart contract, and it can do some smart things at the edge, make a decision, send that decision back to the device can do something, so on and so forth. But if I do that, and if my smart contract involves some sort of AI and stuff like that, well, how do I go back and make sure that the device and the decision it made correlates back to the model, my AI model at the time, with the smart contract? There's all these considerations that people are now just starting to think about. Whereas before, I had IoT devices, I brought all the information into the cloud, I did some stuff, made a decision, and I didn't really push it back down to the device because it was too late by that time. The decision latency was too high. But at least I was more gathering data, but not making it very interactive, and definitely not making it autonomous. So we've had some projects around things like autonomous vehicles talking to infrastructure. So I have a car, and I've got systems in a car, and it's talking to roads and bridges, because I want to know that it's icy. So the sensors are communicating with one another, and also cars that are coming the other way, because I want to tell that car that, hey, when you come here, it's going to be icy. But how, again, do I make sure that that's done in a way that's secure, and I want to track this information? The volume of information is immense, so I can't put all that on the ledger, so then what do I do with it? How do I manage the immutability aspect of the data and correlate that back to my off-chain storage? Tons of considerations here. I've kind of jumped around a little bit here.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of these things, and the whole point of this part of the...
And it's not just the cars talking to each
No,
other.
no, I mean,
it's also the lamp posts that
yeah.
have got IoT device
Yeah.
here that is looking at the traffic, at weather conditions, at various other pieces of information.
No, there's supply chain, there's healthcare, utilities. If I have like wind farms, solar farms, now it's a bi-directional flow of power, right? So under certain contractual conditions, prices and things like that, that solar farm's going to come online, and I'll feed power back into the grid. And then under certain contractual conditions, again, it's going to drop. Well, how do I make sure that that's actually a valid solar farm? How do I make sure that I know what prices actually triggered that flow of power bidirectionally, and what were the conditions that were met, and why did the system behave the way that it did?
And actually, you could even write how much power was consumed or created by the solar panel and write that information directly into the blockchain so that the smart contract would then determine who gets paid how much at what time and all. Yeah, so that's the other piece, the payments part of it.
No, definitely. So the sheer volume of devices, the need to have this bidirectional communications, if you will, the need to reduce the decision latency, like tell the device to respond right to that event, the need to have devices communicate with one another, not just have people in the middle. All those things are really driving a lot of innovation in the blockchain space and how that can be modified, probably, to apply to these IoT-related use cases. So those are the laws and conversations.
Other consensus algorithms.
Whether it is storage, consensus algorithms, even different data structures, just directed acyclic graphs, right, instead of a kind of a linear ledger of sorts. These are all things that now people are looking at. So we're going to see this world evolve quite rapidly in order to support these IoT-related use cases.
Yeah, and the other aspect is about the consensus algorithms is looking at it purely from whether it is a public implementation or private or permission. Mm-hmm. So I look at it as three different buckets. Public is, of course, what we all understand with the Bitcoin. In a permission one, there is usually just one entity that has created a permission ecosystem or network. Say Samsung says that I'm going to create for all my consumers, my dishwashers and my refrigerators and all that. And in a private one, the way I'm looking at it is that there could be, say, in a supply chain where there is a fixed set of suppliers that the product passes through. Then that private one is sort of controlled by those entities, so that the who comes onto it, who gets off it, what data can be written, not is sort of predetermined and predefined.
So we covered a lot, and actually it leads very well into the next question I had for you guys, which, considering the diversity of what we talked, so examples you gave were different examples in different industries.
Right.
Even IoT, right? The IoT devices and the diversity in how they're used is pretty substantial. So if you're looking at blockchain and you're going to design, to be supportive of that kind of IoT in an industry or a use case, do you find that each time it's going to be unique? Will there be some reusability in the approaches? If you think there is reusability, how do you think that might happen? Or are we going to start building a whole new era of applications that are extremely unique to each use case with blockchain and IoT, which is exciting if you're a software.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a number of different drivers here. I mean, from the uniqueness aspect of it, the interaction required with the devices is going to be unique, I think, across different verticals. I mean, how you deal with healthcare-related devices is very different from how you would deal with an infrastructure-related device, which would be very different from a utility-related device and so on. So you are going to have some unique considerations, definitely. The
Some
volume
of
of
those,
information will be
you
different.
mentioned a healthcare device, like a medical device,
Yep.
could be talking about life and death.
Oh, absolutely, right?
Compliance issues
Yeah,
will be very
Compliance,
different.
regulatory, different regulations and things like that. There will be some common patterns. So the need to have a device identity. Yeah, you're going to need that no matter what kind of the vertical happens to be. There'll be likely varying degrees. You're going to have to, again, assure the regulators that you did prove that the
And even
device
within
was.
the device identity, you could have different levels of
Yeah.
trust.
Yeah.
There could be something that just needs the ultimate clearance of security, and the other could be, I know it's good enough, I can trust what you
Right.
do. So,
Right.
and then the kind of encryption or the kind of hardware that we use and the cost of it will be very different, because IoT use cases are very cost sensitive. So that aspect has to be taken
Yeah,
into
that's
account,
true.
because it clearly translates to security, or security, if you try to, how much security built in, will translate to cost.
Right.
So I guess to interpret that, in that very short set of answers, they're going to vary quite a bit. Right?
Yes.
There are some basic little areas such
Yeah.
as identity management and so forth,
Yeah.
but a lot of the things are very
Right.
unique to the.
Some of the ways that you store information, I think that'll translate across different use cases. Smart contract execution, there'll be, I think, some patterns there that can also translate across different use cases. Obviously, the business logic will be different, but the way in which you either deploy, execute, update, what does it mean to actually update a smart contract in an IoT context? Right, that's going to be entertaining. I've got a distributed network of participants. How do they agree that that smart contract is what it should be? How do I version it? How do I roll it back? Right? Somebody made a programming error. We know what happened with Ethereum when people made programming errors, right? Can I afford to do that with an IoT context? Can I just create a fork to back out of a decision that was previously made? These are all kinds of things that are going to need to be addressed, and there's patterns, I think, that will apply, but you're going to have some uniqueness. And you're probably going to have more than one. So as an organization, an enterprise, I will belong to more than one blockchain network, and because some are going to be optimized for certain use cases over others.
So I think that leads to a really interesting next area. Certainly, we know blockchain because of Bitcoin, right? Because of the latest ICO that's going to make everybody rich, or it's an ICO because that's how companies can start to do business, right? But in terms of IoT applications and applying blockchain, there's right now, especially in blockchain on an enterprise level, there's a lot of still immaturity that's going on in the market. So I guess the question I have is, where do you guys possibly see where IoT applications and vertical industries will adopt blockchain? Which verticals do you think might be the adopters or some of the early adopters, or might even be already doing that work today?
You want to go?
I'll throw the one out there that most people talk about. There's implementations around that today. It would be around supply chain.
Yeah.
The gentleman's here too, right? But so that's kind of the first obvious one. It tends to be a little less on what you need from a security, regulatory compliance side, because you're not tending to deal with medical devices and so on, right? And the implementations that are typically been done up until now. People still forget that the accuracy of the data on the ledger is only going to be as accurate as the device, so you've got some of that goes on. But just being able to track the provenance of a product, whatever that might be. It might be an agricultural product. So I've got a head of lettuce that was gotten from some farm somewhere, and I can track that head of lettuce through the complete supply chain all the way to when it shows up in the grocery store, and now I need to issue a recall. Well, it's a lot easier for me now to go and say, oh, where did that thing come from, right? Where the lettuce come from? I can just track it on the ledger. I have an agreed upon, immutable record of everything.
And it's transparent.
And it's transparent.
Try to hide.
Yeah. No, that's right. The trucking company had to agree because the rest of the network had to agree, right? That data was held at the proper.
It's a lot
temperature,
harder
whatever.
to manipulate that blockchain and change
Yeah.
what was in there. It can be done,
Can be done.
technically,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's why immutable. But you're right.
Yeah.
Then you can know exactly where that lettuce came from,
Yeah.
and what temperature it was kept at, and when it was transferred from this truck to that truck, what happened.
Right.
So that level of detail.
Yeah. So that's, I think, you'll see that kind of use case.
Yeah, that audit trail.
The provenance of an asset, and you see it with like high-value goods, paintings. Is that an authentic painting? High-end like fashion sort of, those Prada shoes, are they some a knockoff, or things like that. You'll see a variety of tracking the provenance of the product. Pharmaceuticals is another good one too. What are all the raw materials that made up a pharmaceutical? Right? So there's a lot of use cases just tracking. Right? I always say it's a much better way of doing the old B2B. We've been doing these B2B exchanges for a while. That part of it's not new, but the way in which information is shared, distributed, decentralized, but with a degree of trust because of consensus algorithms and so on, that's the part that's much more, I guess, innovative in that sense, right?
Yeah, one other example I can think of is if you build in the micropayments aspect of it. So I came across this example that was presented somewhere where there was a smart cable, and that smart cable could talk to a smart socket. And then the smart cable, the adapter for that smart cable was just like a regular adapter that you could go into for a car or for a toaster or whatever, right? And the smart cable had some money, cryptocurrency built into it. And then you could use the smart cable to pay for electricity wherever you wanted to. And the smart cable came with a certain amount of money, and you could reload it again, and then go plug it in anywhere. So it's just, I mean, it's a conceptual thing, but essentially, this was they had actually written the code for this with a toaster, but they're saying that they could extend this to a car, for example, when they were an autonomous car.
It sounds like every time I went to the airport, I'd have to pay to plug my laptop in.
Yeah.
So that translated to me.
I don't know how practical this is. I mean, our airport, of course, would give it to you for free, but
Sure
if
they
it
would.
was something like that.
So I guess, so interesting use cases, right?
Actually,
But the point is
Yeah.
that the micropayments or payments aspect of it could be built in.
Yeah, I was going to say before you go out, the key thing that's really pointing out is the creation of new business models.
Yeah.
I think blockchain is going to be an enabler of business models that we haven't even thought of yet. So it's creative ideas and thoughts and stuff. I mean, maybe that takes off or maybe it doesn't, right?
it's not,
But it is going to be a series of new business models. We don't even know what does it really mean to have devices pay one another for capability? Do we know?
So I'm glad you actually continued on, because you went right into the next one.
I knew that. I was looking.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about the business case, right? The business justification, the ROI, those areas in which business looks at to why they're going to invest in a new technology, especially something that right now, again, seems to have a lot of hype. Actually, both sides of those worlds, right? IoT and blockchain.
Right.
Though I think everybody in the room agrees these things are very significant
Convergence of both.
technologies,
Yeah.
right? But businesses do make investments for a reason. I mean, it's a business case or an ROI they see. So what might be some of those areas you guys might see, might get a call out? Why would you?
Meaning how to get the.
Why a business would invest? What are some of the business cases or ROIs you have seen why companies have started to invest and leverage blockchain with IoT?
Yeah, so I think one aspect of it is again, goes from business perspective, it's about transactions and money. So where you can eliminate some kind of middleman that, not specifically from an IoT perspective, but from a blockchain perspective. If you're able to eliminate that middle person, and the transaction can be done in a with much less friction and much more smoothly, much more quickly. It may be across multiple currencies. So that is where some of the ROI immediately becomes possible, because all of a sudden there's a piece of the payment that was going to some third party which is adding no value to the actual transaction.
But taking a percentage of the transaction.
Exactly. So that is where the immediate ROI becomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well, because if you go in and talk to a business unit about, blockchain, we're going to use that. They're going to go, what? We only know of blockchain from Bitcoin, and we all know that people are just laundering money on there. You still get that perception.
By the way, it's usually IT that's saying that, not the business.
That's probably true too. So you normally find, this is again no different from any other technology in many ways that one would want to look at. You need to find that use case. There is some business pain there that the business is trying to solve. So in this case, it could be, I need to increase visibility throughout my supply chain in order to reduce the fines that I incur because of X, Y, Z, right? Whatever that happens to be. Or I need to increase the overall efficiency. I need better visibility so that I can reduce costs because I can make the transfer of information more seamless between my different trading partners, which will increase efficiency, and then, as I mentioned, so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of things that they're looking for. So blockchain is an enabler, potentially, if you get the mapping right between the technology and the use case, which is not always done correctly. But if you get that mapping right, I find that it's effective to kind of implement or execute a POC, proof of concept, internally, as a way to showcase the capability of this technology for that particular use case. Right? You just don't go and say, hey, we're going to implement blockchain for the sake of implementing blockchain. They want to see it, right? They have to kind of look at what the interaction would be before, after, the value that it would bring, and so on. And plus, the team that's implementing it, typically they're going to need to get experience with the technology anyway, because it's going to be new for a lot of organizations and a lot of IT teams and so on, right? They also have to get their hands and play with the technology. So a POC like that can serve two purposes. One is improve an overall business process, and that's where most people start. They don't actually normally start with the brand new, completely off-the-wall smart cable type of idea. They actually just want to improve an existing process, and that's easier to sell because they already understand it. They already understand the problems associated with it. So a proof of concept can then serve two purposes. One is show them how this problem could be solved, and the other aspect of it is you gain experience as a technology team, and you start to learn when to use it, and also more importantly, when not to use it. Right? I had one organization say, I got all these images, I'm going to store them on the blockchain. How big are these images? Well, they're satellite images. No, right? Don't do that, right? That's not a good idea, at least given the current state of a lot of the technology. Now, can I create a hybrid model with some on-chain, off-chain kind of techniques, or some of these new emerging technology approaches? Yeah, maybe potentially. But you still got to look at the use case, map it back to the technology, see if it's going to be relevant, see what value it's going to bring. A lot of that is not new. We still need to do that, regardless of what the hype tells us.
Yeah, and typically the business doesn't care a lot about hype around technology.
No.
They care about an ROI.
Unless it's a Tibco, then it's good.
So unless it's what?
Tibco, then we're good. I'm selling my idea. I'm working hard on it, man. I'm trying.
Right. If it works, you think you got it, let me know. I'll jump in early.
Yeah, that's right.
So, we've been talking a lot about blockchain in IoT, but what about blockchain in maybe some other areas that are similar or other as the organization where you think blockchain can provide value as well?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I was thinking more from a security perspective, like the Equifax thing that we have all lived through, and the 150 million people who got affected. And a lot of that happened because it essentially was an AWS that it was being hosted, and Equifax didn't protect that information properly. And so the US government and other governments are very interested in using blockchain-like technology where you could actually not have date of birth and social security number and private information be displayed. I take everybody's driver's license today has your photo and your name and your date of birth and your address. That's very sensitive information. So even if you go to the bank right now, the bank will tell you when you print your checks, we recommend not to put your name and address on it because you're going to write that check. Nobody writes checks anymore, but that's what they're still writing. That's what they recommend.
Oh, no, my
so
wife's this.
But the point I'm trying to make is that blockchain, the way it could solve this issue is that you're issued a public address. Of course, the government is behind that public address. And everybody can see that public address. It's just a hash. So who cares who sees it? And none of your private information is revealed in the process, and you use that public address as your face to the world. So that's just one idea that is being worked on, and I think very seriously by some governments.
I think a comparable thing we see today, for example, Apple Pay, right? And when you do Apple Pay, nobody knows who your credit card is. You have a unique identifier that's to that transaction, and your credit card information, your information is never shared, right?
So that's the permission blockchain example that I was talking about,
Yeah.
right?
Makes
No,
sense.
identity is a big one. So if we each had control over our own identities and then enabled other organizations to have it, I could actually sell that too. That's got value. So you make some money off of all that information I freely give to all the websites I put my name and address into, right? And then they track me. So there's that aspect. You take control back of your identity. I think even organizations, if you look at finance, things like anti-money laundering and fraud detection, blockchain can help out even in that area, right? What do you have? Even in the simplest form, you'd have a network of banks, and you want white lists or black lists to be shared between these institutions. They don't really do a great job of that today. So even having a validated, agreed upon, immutable list of people that you either want to do business with or don't want to do business with, even that would have value. Know your customer, KYC. You'll often hear of that as a use case, right? I want to have more information about the customers, but again, do it in a way that conforms to things like GDPR and personal information, kind of privacy regulations, and so on and so forth. So there's listed use cases goes on and on. Government's a good one. You'll hear about government to citizen, government to government type use cases, government to contractor. I don't want to validate that the contractor actually did everything that they promised to do. How do I validate what they did against the contractual obligations? Well, it's all in the ledger. They agreed to it. It's on there. I can go back and prove that they should have done or didn't do or whatever it was.
Yeah, a very simple example in that, whether they did or not do, is the case of a renter. The renter signs a rental agreement and says, I'm going to pay you rent on the first of the month, but he doesn't pay it, right? So then the landlord goes and fights with that, right? But here, if it was all on a smart contract, the money just comes out straight out of the bank. So there's no, and legal fees and all those things are saved, and the process time is saved, and the people who were supposed to get paid got paid in time.
Although that brings up an interesting point. I always ask, are there any lawyers in the crowd? Because I always ask this question, right? So you mentioned smart contracts, and you mentioned legal in the same sentence. So I always ask, are smart contracts legal contracts?
Oh, okay, that's a whole different topic, because I actually moderated a panel on that whole.
Oh, okay, well, I didn't mean to.
But anyway, so the one point I would make
Otherwise,
is that.
we have 3 hours now on that one, just on that topic.
Anyway, so one point that really came out of that is that so there was a guy on my panel who was from a law firm who is doing a lot of ICOs and blockchain implementation. And the interesting point of discussion was that these guys, what was being discussed is, how do you know that the smart contract code was written correctly? Because the smart contract code could have errors, and who takes liability for that code? Does the legal firm take contract responsibility for it? Because they were the ones who were behind the contract?
Sure.
Or the person who wrote the code take this, or the company who takes it? So the legal firms that are involved in the blockchain aspect of it are now hiring a lot of code writers, because it is becoming
interpretation of the code to see it. Yeah.
So it's just interesting.
Yeah, the general consensus that I've gotten whenever I've asked lawyers in my audience, they go, maybe. That's the answer, because there's no real precedence. I mean, what do they base the decision on, right? So until...
The law certainly doesn't know what to do.
Yeah.
If a case like that ended up in court, then I don't think
your guess is as good as mine at that point. Absolutely.
Right.
So that's another area that,
There's a lot of pitfalls in actually the implementation aspect. Standards is another pitfall. There's hardly any standards, and
which when you're dealing with 1 million IoT devices is a bit of an issue.
Yeah.
There is no standard. And the
And
technology
standards is a real chicken and egg problem, because standards don't make sense unless a lot of people are using it. A lot of people are not using it, so there is no standard. So that aspect needs to be addressed.
So so standards, I think, goes into one of the next questions, which is talking about some of the challenges organizations face within blockchain and blockchain to IoT. I think one of the other ones to cover, I think Nelson, you tossed this one in, which is always fun, or some of the myths around blockchain, right? Especially blockchain. But I think we can apply to IoT use cases just as well. So thoughts on that? Challenges, myths around blockchain and IoT?
So how many people fully believe that blockchain is completely decentralized? I got no arms that went up, that's good. Sometimes the purists in the crowd will say that it is, right? But when you look at even the people that run or manage the Bitcoin code base, the Ethereum code base, actually a lot of these code bases, how many people run that code base? So it's interesting that it's a handful of people. Is that, is that completely decentralized, right? So you've got those kind of aspects. Or they'll even say, well, blockchain is immutable. It's like, have you ever heard of a fork? So what is that? There's that aspect of it too. So then I can go back and change it, kind of, right? But on the enterprise side, as you alluded to, that's a different concept because I'm likely going to have errors that I need to roll back in a blockchain, but given that it's an append-only database in essence, from a distributed ledger point of view, how do I back out a transaction? So there's these different myths that some people they'll toss out there without actually thinking about it, especially from an enterprise context. These are all things that businesses need to think about. And they often, just kind of gloss over that aspect of it without actually realizing the implications. Or even, how you do things like versioning and the management of the network and who's going to run what and how do I make sure that everybody agrees on what the code should be and all those kinds of things, right? Those are all key considerations for an enterprise. And when you add on IoT, you've just taken it from a problem where I've got a group of 20 or a group of 100, and you've multiplied that out exponentially out to all these now different devices. And that's why I think you'll see, the technology has to evolve, but also just the models around how you're going to support it and run it and so on have to evolve.
And it's not free.
And
that
it's
has
not
to
free.
remember, right? Because
Sure.
there is computation that needs to be done, things have to be hosted somewhere, stored somewhere. And this is where that myth aspect comes in because people don't bring that up front. They will talk about how wonderful blockchain is and what all it can solve for you and this is the application. So I think one question that everybody should ask when somebody presents a blockchain use case and example for you is, try to understand the cost associated behind it. Where is it going to be hosted? Who's going to host it? Who's going to pay for all the resources? Because it can be pretty substantial, depending on the consensus algorithm and how long is it going to take for it to reach consensus, for example. It depends on how it has been architected. And it may not be very useful if it is implemented in a certain way versus another.
So talking just about that, it kind of goes back to something we were chatting about just a few minutes ago on the business case, the ROI.
ROI needs to be justified.
So when the company is standing that up and they're looking at ROI, the ROI just isn't about their ROI because the blockchain typically isn't just about them.
That's
It
a point,
involves
yeah.
other companies as well. And so to make it of value, these other companies are going to have to agree that there's ROI for them because their investment they're going to make,
Yeah.
right? So there's a lot of partnering. We were chatting earlier today about the uniqueness, both in blockchain and even especially in IoT, that there is not going to be a single vendor in any of these cases. It's going to be
in supply
very
chain situation, there
symbiotic,
will be many
right,
relationship.
relationship, and it's very symbiotic with companies to company.
That's true. That's even more important in this context than it is in other contexts in the past, right? Creation of consortiums, right? These bring together a whole bunch of companies and have them work together to sort out how they can all, even though they might compete with one another, but they also want to benefit from the efficiencies that they could gain by employing this kind of technology. And you'll definitely see more of that. There's probably more consortiums around different blockchain-based solutions than there have been around other types of solutions in the past.
So the last one I was going to ask you, we're going to get a little deeper in technology here, or as deep as you want to go. But talking about some of the technical considerations, some of the differences, looking at the blockchain stacks that are out there. There's a lot of them. There's new ones popping up every single day. How.
There's only 60 or 70-ish right now.
Now 71.
Yeah, probably. Wait another moment. 72. Yeah.
Right. And applying those to to IoT and the use cases. Let's talk about some of those platforms and maybe some of the things you see that make sense. Or how you see them being used and the differences between the platforms.
I mean, I think one of the obvious things is the data structure underneath the ledger. I mean, you could Tangle, IOTA, right? They're using more of a graph-like structure. And in fact, there's even articles out there that'll talk about the next generation of blockchains are actually not going to be a ledger, there are actually going to be multiple ledgers, potentially arranged either in a hierarchical structure or in a graph structure. There's situations.
There's also the combination of private and public working
Yeah,
together,
combinations,
like the
yeah.
plasma concept of Ethereum.
Yeah, no, that's right. Then
Because that speeds up things quite a bit.
yeah, the structures
because
deal a lot with performance.
yeah,
Yes.
Performance,
Yeah.
yeah. Also,
Yeah.
performance and cost, because you have to trade the two off at
Yeah,
some point.
that's very true.
Yeah.
So the underlying data structures, I think, are a big part of where you get around the technical differences, right? How that's got to evolve to support, especially IoT-related use cases. Consensus, of course, is one of those things you mentioned earlier. So Tangle will say, well, I have a transaction, I have to validate 2 other transactions before I can submit my transaction. Well, that's very different from what a proof of work is going to be. Where you hand it off to a mining pool and they pound away and generate or consume, umpteen amounts of electricity.
This type of mining kind of
Right.
concept does not translate very well to IoT, in
Right.
my opinion. I think in general, it will not be that mining type, it will be a different.
Yeah. Now, whether it's this,
Proof of stake is
Yeah.
a possibility.
Yeah, that's
There's
possible.
also the proof of elapsed time,
Mhm.
was another one.
yeah. And then, as you moved into public and private and permission networks, some of the Byzantine fault tolerance, there's different flavors of that now emerging. So that's a whole other area of research.
The fault tolerant aspect of blockchain is pretty useful. I
Sure.
think,
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
fundamentally built into it because it's distributed, so there's no one point of failure.
Right.
That is.
Except in certain blockchain technologies where there actually is. Right? If you look at the underpinnings behind it, some of them say, oh yeah, well I've got this system, but everything funnels in through this single
Eventually,
service, right?
Yeah. So that's the single point.
So yeah, you've got a single pointer. So some of them, they're not truly purely distributed. You have to look out for those kind of things and what is the reality of some of these technology stacks?
So, we talking about that and earlier talking about, the differences in the stacks. Certainly it's generating a whole new set of skill sets out there, including programming and programming language skill sets that are being invented, and lack of standards, right, and all these things. We've seen this before in all kinds of technologies,
Right.
and before those technologies really ever moved further forward, they had become somewhat standard. Typically, somebody starts to be the winner, Oracle database or whoever it is, right? So do we think any one of the ones we're looking at, are any of the stacks, the big stacks after the day, are they going to be, you think, the winner?
Maybe the name will stay. I think the technology underneath the name will evolve, right? I mean, that's going to rapidly change. I think most of the stacks that are out there, and again, I'm talking from an enterprise context. Bitcoin's been proven to work for its purpose, very limited functionality, really. From an enterprise context, the stacks are going to evolve. And again, there's going to be many, many, many of them. And then there's going to be some convergence side. And probably the one that's going to win is one that's not even really been invented yet. And you'll have more than one, right? I mean, it's not going to just be, it's like a database. You have NoSQL stores, you have graph stores, you have this, that, the other thing, right? And you use them because they're optimized for different types of use cases. Blockchain stacks will likely be the same thing. You're going to end up with more than one.
Which is good. Competition is good. Competition makes for stronger technology. It pushes us as a company to excel at what we do. Apple has gotten better because of competition from Samsung and from others, right? And vice versa. So
On the
competition.
flip side, the fragmentation can slow down the adoption, right?
There is that.
part.
Right,
You have to always keep.
So it's funny, we just talked about blockchain, and we're going to wrap this up. Blockchain and the winner in blockchain, and it becomes really interesting. It becomes like a Rubik's Cube. Let's put blockchain and IoT together and talk about the standards and who's going to win there.
Nobody and machine learning.
Exactly, right.
What did you say there was for IoT security companies? There was like 100 and some odd ones you were tracking. Yeah.
Like 80, 85.
85, okay.
IoT
Yeah.
security companies.
Okay. So there you go. I mean,
And you gave me a new one
security,
today.
you've got
I
that.
mean, and I was able to add one to your list today. It's awesome.
Right, so yeah, you create that.
By the way, that's the only one I do. It's good. Well, I got lucky.
And that's the only one I didn't have.
That's fine.
Well, again, so fantastic sharing with you guys today about blockchain and IoT. So I appreciate you guys your time. Thank you. So we have time. We want to open it up for questions from the audience. Things you might like to
Comments,
ask.
questions?
I'm Lucia. Thanks for being here hosting this event. I want to bring the topic back to when you mentioned about supply chain, right? Blockchain that's pretty promising at this point. How far are you in that user case or proof of concept journey? And in the future, when you're talking to enterprises, what kind of drivers you need to see to really trust that not only does blockchain has potential, but you can actually commercialize and monetize it. And on the other side of the token, maybe what kind of red flags you have to see to think about, okay, you have to call it quit, you have to have an exit strategy.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, initial comments on it. Most organizations, I would say, are looking at it more from not necessarily the IoT aspect of it, but they want to use blockchain as a way to initially start to collect the data, if that makes sense. So they aren't necessarily going all the way out to the farmer's field and scanning lettuce, or I don't know how you do that, but you got some of those kinds of problems. But most of them are saying, I initially want to create some sort of system where I have multiple participants. If you have 2 participants, it's kind of useless. So I have multiple participants, and they all need to better exchange information. They need to do it in a more automated fashion, like then utilize smart contracts and some of these things to kind of drive the business logic. That's a lot of the use cases that I've seen, that's where they start. So they aren't going down to exactly the edge, deploying blockchain nodes out closer on an IoT device, or even baking into the firmware of an IoT device, blockchain related logic directly. So most of them have started with, let's create the network, let's get some participants together, let's come up with a better sharing of information, and then we'll gradually start to push it out to closer to the edge so that I have better information feeds into that collection, if you will. So that's a lot of what we've seen, and I know there's varying degrees of this, but a lot of what we've seen and what we've engaged in are at that level.
So is it fair to say the industry has interest in that, but they're not at the point of having you to build a user case yet?
So they're having us build user cases to the degree that they're trying to prove what this technology could do for them, right? Now, you've got always a conversations of, well, there's different approaches to this. There's other ways you could actually solve this type of problem. So in many ways, you're not only implementing or proving the value of a particular use case, but you're also painting a broader vision in terms of what it could do. And that's going to require some buy-in and some visionaries on the business side to be able to support this. So the use cases are there, the initial implementations of a use case are there. I've had some organizations that we worked with implement the blockchain technology completely in-house, like completely a private blockchain implementation, right?
Own consensus, everything.
Everything is on their own. And it had some value, not the large value that the promise of the network and all this kind of stuff would bring, but that's how they wanted to start, because they needed to learn and get to figure out what the technology could do, not do, get their people skilled up, and prove to the business that, hey, you know what, this is what it did with this little problem. Imagine if we added this or added that and so on. So it's going to be evolutionary. It's very rare that they just say, Big Bang Theory, let's put the whole thing in place right out of the gate and we're good to go. Organizations have not done that, right? Even organizations like R3 and Corda, right? Big financial consortiums and a group of 80, 90, however many companies they have now as part of that consortium. Small pieces, right? They're just doing it incrementally over time.
And my second part of the question was, what kind of drivers you to see to either make or break?
Right. Yeah, and it goes back to some of our earlier comments too around if you define the use case itself and the goals associated with the use case, along with some metrics, need to be fairly clear up front. I'm not telling anything new, because you would do that no matter what the technology or problem was that you were trying to solve. That doesn't change. It changes in the sense that you need to include other participants probably to prove the overall value of the entire solution.
And everybody has to agree.
And everybody has to agree, yeah. That's why some of this stuff takes so long as a result too. But if you do that, then you have to try and measure what your proof of concept was, or this initial use case was, how that maps back to that value.
So if it is a very complex supply chain, probably very hard to quickly get to. But if it's a simpler blockchain where there is fewer parties involved and there are fewer exchanges of information or assets, whether perishable or non-perishable assets, it'll be easier to So that'll become sort of the starting point. But
Yeah.
because there's a lot of considerations before you can actually make it work seamlessly. There are a lot of technology that needs to go behind it. It's not a simple thing to do.
Yeah, and so people have usually started with use cases where if it completely blew up and didn't work, their business is not shut down, right? They haven't started with that use case right out of the gate. But it's that mapping, right? Show the value, whether it's on a well-defined use case with defined SLAs, KPIs, those kinds of things, and then gradually expand it. Like I've had organizations say, we're just doing it all internally, but my participants are actually all my business units. So they can show the value of better information sharing globally, let's say, across their business units. They can put a box around it so that from a security standpoint and the algorithms they're going to use and how they manage things like code and versioning and all that kind of stuff, it's all within the same company. Different business units, but all in the same company. So that makes it easier. You can still show some of the value, and then imagine now if you say, well, next step is to extend that to a couple of key trading partners. And then I extend it a little bit further, and I extend it a little bit further, then they start to introduce new business models, right? This is the incremental vision that typically one is painting when you're building these things out in the enterprise. Yes?
I want to build up on that question. Can you give examples of the kind of metrics that are evaluated when they're kind of drawn, putting the use case on a whiteboard, so to speak?
Yeah.
Just so that we get a flavor for what some of these drivers are
Sure.
in terms of metrics.
Yeah. It's, so I usually have different measures of what I call decision latency. So I've got, just trying to think of a particular example. I've got a customer where it's more around just claims processing, right? How do I move a claim from payer to provider, that sort of thing? How much time does that currently take today? What do I lose in terms of fraud? What is the cost of fraudulent claims to me? If I increase the rate at which claims were processed and I moved it from, I'm just going to make up a number here, like 3 days to an hour, what is the benefit to the business of that? Right, so those are the kinds of metrics. So that, usually
you can see an ROI.
you see an ROI based on that. Yeah. And so I call that decision latency, right? The time between when something happens and the time between when you need to make a decision. IoT feeds into this because, of course, you want to try and shrink that down to the point where even the device itself is making decisions, which I need to record. I need to understand why they're making the decision they are. But that's also related to decision latency. And this could be just related to time, the speed, the accuracy, again, things like fraud, transactions that go outside of what are normal transactions. Those are the kinds of things that a lot of companies, at least in the supply chain context, will talk about.
Okay, thank you.
Can you talk about be a little bit more specific about the things that you're trying to do? Are you trying to build on top of Hyperledger? I mean,
sure.
what's the flavor of?
So when we look at it, so again, we're an enterprise software company. So we're dealing with companies that have existing systems, first of all. So I've got a airline. They have mainframes. Well, then they just don't go and say, we're going to put a blockchain in and we can get rid of our mainframe. Yeah, no, right? First of all, I won't be able to fly anywhere. Oh, that could be a good thing. But those kinds, they have existing systems. So you have to look at it and say, well, the first thing I need to do is figure out how to get data into the blockchain technology and get data out of the blockchain technology. Because some trading partner of mine, some participant in the network, is going to add things into the ledger, which I need to trigger back-end systems as a response to that. And then vice versa. If someone does something to the back-end system, I need to feed data back into that. So as an example, we wrapped Hyperledger Fabric with sort of a set of APIs and a sort of integration capabilities where I could then talk to that mainframe. Now, certain things like, I can go that a little bit further and I can say, well, what about smart contracts? So whether I'm writing in Hyperledger Fabric or whether I'm using R3 Corda, which kind of has, it's not quite a blockchain in the same way as Hyperledger Fabric, but they also have the notion of smart contracts and logic and flows and these kinds of things. But if you go back to picking a winner, if I write all my business logic using the proprietary language of that particular blockchain technology, and tomorrow somebody else wins, do I want to incur the cost of having to rewrite all of that? And in some cases the answer is yes, and in some cases the answer is no. I don't want to have to rewrite this thing every single time when a new stack comes out that now is more fitting to my use case. So we looked at creating abstraction layers on top of that. So I can take a smart contract and run it anywhere. Right? So, and then the third thing you normally run into is, I have all this information in the ledger. I got all this wonderful supply chain data. All my participants have put in data that I know is 100% accurate, because I trust all my IoT devices somehow automatically, right, all this kind of stuff. I want to know how my supply chain is performing. How do I measure those KPIs? How do you do analytics on top of a ledger today? What do people do? They tend to have a system that says, I put something into the ledger and I also put it into a data store. How do I make sure that what's in the ledger is a proper representation of what's in the data store, and somebody just didn't go and change the data store on me? But how do I do analytics at scale against a large amount of data potentially? I got every transaction from every network participant, for every product that I want to track. I need to do that at scale. So there's some of these interesting challenges now that, when we're working on the technologies that we need to actually look at. So Hyperledger Fabric is probably one of the more common ones, right? Originally built as a permission blockchain technology. We see that a lot. Different Ethereum forks kind of thing. Quorum has some interest because of things like zero knowledge proofs. So how can I prove that this transaction is actually valid without telling you anything about the transaction? Kind of like, where's Waldo? And I can prove to you that I know where Waldo is without showing you where Waldo is. It's kind of one of those things. Quorum, R3 Corda, probably from a financial insurance standpoint. But there's tons, right? I mean, Disney had one. And then they open sourced it, created a new company called Dragon Chain. I mean, there's a bunch of these things. So it's a mixture of technologies. Some of them are very, very different. There's a kind of a new evolution in things like Neo and Cardano and some of these other technology stacks, which promise to bring mathematically provable capabilities to this, the logic execution and so on and so forth. So there's a number. But those are some of the areas in which we've looked at and are working with. I could go on and on, but just to kind of give you an example. Hyperledger Fabric is probably the one that's, in an enterprise context, most common. Ethereum's probably, some flavor of Ethereum's probably next. And R3 Corda, depending on consortiums and what you're dealing with, they're probably third.
Yeah, one of the things we're good at as a company is letting disparate systems talk to each other in a common way.
Yeah, you need to from an enterprise, right? I mean, they're not getting rid of all their systems all of a sudden and saying, blockchain, that's it, right?
Yep.
So you somehow got to figure out how to mesh those two worlds together.
We've been doing that for a long time.
Even things like smart contracts, when they look data up from an external source, well, I can't just do a lookup and get an answer back, because I have a whole network of smart contracts that all have to run in some cases, and they all have to agree on the answer. So if 3 of them ask the question and they all get back a different answer, well, they're not going to agree. That transaction will be rejected because they never reach consensus. So then you get into oracles, right? External sources of data. But what's an oracle? How do I confirm that that oracle is who it's supposed to be? So there's all these considerations that you run into on the enterprise side when it comes to adoption of this technology. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing some of the areas that you guys have looked at and some of the use cases you're working on. Any of them that have gone to production?
Small scale, yeah. Let's see, permissioned and private context. Those would be, and small scale production. They didn't roll it out to.
I mean, what type of application was that?
Healthcare and travel.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 different ones, not healthcare and travel.
And how is it going? Yeah. How is it going so far?
Good, yes. Again, it's an incremental approach. One was a private blockchain, and so for them, it was successful. It did what it was supposed to do. Now they're looking to see how they can expand it to more of a permissioned context, right? Bring some of their immediate business partners into the mix. So implementation 1 met their KPIs and the goals of the use case. That was fine. The healthcare one, also same sort of thing. Stood up. Initially, met the initial requirements, and it's going to continue to evolve from there.
Which platform?
One's Hyperledger Fabric. The other one was an Ethereum fork.
Okay, cool, thank you.
So one quick question is that, what do you see the trend like? What are the kind of business applications do you see this blockchain technology can be adopted to? Are there any kind of trends that you see being looked for?
Trends, yeah, that's a good one. Use cases across different verticals. Trends. I think it just, improving efficiency in terms of what used to be a B2B driven transaction. That's kind of from our standpoint, what we see that's what a lot of organizations are looking at. So whether it's things like, I'm a casino, and I want to execute a loyalty program, and the loyalty program involves a number of partners, right? The guy that manages and does helicopter tours, and the other guy that manages, some kind of, I don't know, whatever kinds of, I'm not, yeah, what? Shoe shine? Shoe shine. I'm not sure if people in Vegas are looking for shoe shine aspects to part of a loyalty program, but that's interesting. But it's this exchange of information across what typically would be done through APIs or B2B exchanges or things like that, right? EDI, these EDI exchanges. That used to be the way that we would do this in the past. RosettaNet, for people that are as old as I am and remember what that even is. Those kinds of things, that's what, generally speaking, people will look at. How do I improve the efficiency of an existing business process as opposed to, I want to come up with something that's brand new and completely innovative in that sense.
Just to extend on that real quick,
Yeah.
so in an EDI network, right, and for those, how many people know what EDI is? Yeah, it's a painful thing to talk about. It's very costly for companies to get involved and engaged in EDI-based, B2B. So to extend just a little bit on that question, what do we think about blockchain and allowing the smaller businesses and the smaller individuals and others to maybe participate as a supplier within a trusted network versus something they never could have done, in an EDI-based network?
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, some of these organizations are small. They're not necessarily going to stand up the infrastructure to run a blockchain node, right? So how do you engage them and have them participate in this type of a network infrastructure?
There's a cost associated.
There's a cost associated with that as well, right? And some of these firms they're
But
smaller.
does it become a cloud service too?
Yeah.
Become a cloud service.
Yeah, it becomes a cloud service then in some cases, absolutely. So that's why you'll see, BaaS, right? Blockchain as a service. Well, a lot of the major cloud providers, the Azures of the world and so on. AWS just announced the ability to stand up blockchain technology there using cloud formation templates. IBM's got them, right? So they're offering these capabilities. And quite frankly, I usually recommend them as a nice, easy way to quickly spin something up and try it. You can get most of these technologies in Docker containers. So I've got them running on my laptop, right? We just Docker compose, up, boom. Now I've got a whole, I've got a orderer, I've got an endorser, I've got a peer, I've got all the pieces that I need in order to run a small, self-contained blockchain network. At least I can code against it and try it. So I always tell people to try it. But definitely, the way in which people will get engaged or involved in a blockchain network has got to involve more than just a big traditional enterprise that could actually host and run this thing on their own. And the cloud is one way to do that. But not everybody needs that. You can have apps on your phone, there's web interfaces, right? The equivalent of what an enterprise wallet would mean, right? Things like that as well.
So we have time for one more question.
So, blockchain is hot, everybody talk about today.
Mm-hmm.
So I should ask this question, do you think it's a hype? Do you think it's a hype?
Oh, do I think it's a hype?
And if you don't think it's a hype, where do you see that it will go in the next 1 to 2 years? Or 5 years?
Sure. You better extend the time frame a little bit. I think in a year, much of this discussion I would think will be similar. We'll have new technology stacks we'll probably talk about. We'll have new approaches. I think we'll still be talking about the applicability of it and what use cases are relevant and how you measure the success of it. I think we're still going to have that in here. We'll have more things in production, which will be good. Is it hype? Part of it definitely is. I think that, I don't think everybody will be trying to introduce tokens. I think they're going to be looking for
But
use
I think,
cases
as we
outside.
were talking earlier, I think clearly it offers some clear properties, so to speak, that it has, or features that it has, that lend themselves to business situations very well. And if the costs can be reduced in the process, efficiency can be improved, friction can be reduced in the transactions, people will do it. I mean, but then again, the cost aspect has to be justified all the time. And
I mean, the concepts have
So it's sort of a
promise.
navigation process to me that, okay, I can see the cost, see the effort that is involved, I can see the benefit over years, how can we match the two and say, this is how we come?
I mean, you're gonna see this though, right?
One-
Because right now, it can solve every business problem known to man. You're gonna see this, I mean, and we've been through this with so many other technologies, right? But I don't think this is gonna be one of those things that just kind of goes away completely.
No, not at all.
I think
This is
there's definitely
fundamentally, there's
fundamental
something
concepts here, yes.
very
Yeah.
interesting that it does.
Yeah, one last question, possibly?
Yeah, one more.
Yeah. So.
Just for you,
Yeah,
just for
so
you.
any comments on the timeline for standards? You know, when will we have? Or is Tibco, is Tibco involved or contributing to the standards?
So, we are involved in, let's see, when you look at the standards bodies that are out there, of which in some ways there's just as many as there are blockchain platforms, right?
Yeah. Which
So
is expected.
It's to be
at the
expected
stage.
initially. I mean, there's the new Decentralized Identity Foundation, right? They're trying to put standards around blockchain and identity. There's a Trusted IoT
Trusted IoT
Alliance.
Yeah.
There's a number, and there's obviously
Cisco.
the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, there's Hyperledger, there's all these organizations that are looking to create.
And just within the Linux Foundation, within Hyperledger, there's so many.
Yeah, there's so many
And
projects.
those are addressing specific problems or specific use cases, and they are different from each other, they're solving specific problems. So just Hyperledger by itself could address a majority of it, everything under the
Yeah.
Linux Foundation.
And then you've got, so from our standpoint, you've got the technology standards, of which we're trying to work on in some areas, mostly around smart contracts and things like that. But then you've also got the, I'll call them interoperability standards. So Swift, as an example, right, developed formats for exchanging financial transactions and so on. What does blockchain mean to them? And what do their standards, how does that translate into a blockchain network? So we're having some conversations with organizations like that in terms of what that should look like. You're probably going to end up with consortiums, like there'll be a supply chain one, and there'll be a healthcare one, and you'll end up with multiples of those, and that's going to evolve. You can tell by the length of our answer that the length of standard development will be even longer.
There's certain layer standards from the past that you need to see, right?
Yeah, it's the way that it is, right? Yeah.
I don't think any of the technologies we have today will improve.
So, more than 2 years, less than 5 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your guess is as good as mine at that
Okay,
point,
okay.
right? Yeah, if I had that kind of crystal ball, I'd be in the Bahamas somewhere. Or something along
No, how
those
does it matter,
lines. For
right?
legal reasons.
So even if we had a crystal ball, just because the standard's gonna come 3 years from now, what good is that at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's important to understand implications of that. It's important when you create these consortiums that you are thinking about that at least. The abstractions get important, but you don't tie yourself to a particular technology. But even when you look at things like SQL, as an example, that was a standard. How many different flavors and extensions of that standard were there? And, the list goes on and on. So
On and on.
it'd be interesting. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Oh, thank you guys so much for your time, appreciate it.
No, thanks for the question.